the haunted asylum on the outskirts of a small, quiet town stood a building no one dared to visit. The old asylum, abandoned for decades, loomed like a dark shadow against the sky. Its windows were broken, and the once grand walls were now covered in vines and graffiti. Stories about the asylum had been passed down for years. People talked about strange sounds, ghostly figures, and unexplained disappearances. No one had been brave enough to stay there for long, until now. It was Halloween night, and a group of 5 friends gathered in a dimly lit living room. They were Max, the confident leader, Elisa, his brave but skeptical best friend Jake, the joker of the group Sarah, the quiet and thoughtful one, and Emma, who loved ghost stories but scared easily. They were all excited and nervous as they discussed their daring plan to spend the night in the haunted asylum. "Come on, it's just an old building," Max said, trying to sound fearless. "We'll prove all those ghost stories are fake. Or we'll be the next ones to disappear," Jake joked, but his laugh was uneasy. "What if the stories are true?" Sarah asked softly. "What if something bad really happened there?" Lisa rolled her eyes. "There's only one way to find out. Let's go." The friends grabbed flashlights, snacks, and blankets, stuffing everything into their backpacks. As they walked through the quiet town, the streets were filled with kids trick-or-treating and pumpkins glowing on porches. But as they got closer to the asylum, the air grew colder, and the cheerful sounds faded. By the time they reached the gates, it was completely silent. The asylum's tall, rusted gates creaked loudly as Max pushed them open. The friends stood in front of the massive building, their flashlights barely illuminating the eerie entrance. "Ready?" Max asked, his voice steady but quieter than before. No one answered, but they all stepped forward together. The heavy front door groaned as they pushed it open, and a cloud of dust rose in the air. Inside, the asylum was even darker and colder. The hallways stretched endlessly, and their footsteps echoed loudly. Broken furniture, shattered glass, and strange marks covered the floor and walls. "This place is seriously creepy," Emma whispered, clutching her flashlight tightly. "Let's check out the main hall first," Max suggested, leading the way. They walked carefully, their flashlights cutting through the darkness. As they reached the main hall, they saw old chairs and a reception desk covered in dust. Faded papers were scattered across the floor. On one wall, a large clock was frozen at midnight. "It's like time stopped here," Sarah said, staring at the clock. Jake picked up a piece of paper from the floor. "Patient records," he said, squinting at the faded writing. "These are from the 1950s. Looks like this place closed down after." He stopped reading, his face pale. "After what?" Lisa asked, stepping closer. "After a bunch of patients went missing," Jake finished. "And no one ever found them." The friends exchanged uneasy glances, but decided to keep exploring. They moved through the hallways, opening doors and peeking into rooms. Some rooms were empty, while others still had old hospital beds and rusted equipment. In one room, they found a wheelchair tipped over on its side. "This is like something out of a horror movie," Emma said, her voice trembling. Suddenly, a loud bang echoed through the hallway. Everyone froze, their flashlights darting around. "What was that?" Lisa whispered. "Probably just the wind," Max said, though he didn't sound convinced. "There's no wind in here," Sarah pointed out. "Let's go see," Max said, trying to sound brave. They followed the sound to a large metal door at the end of the hallway. It was slightly open, and behind it was a staircase leading down. "The basement," Jake said. "Of course, it's the basement. We don't have to go down there," Sarah said, but Max was already stepping onto the first stair. "Come on," he said. "We can't stop now." Reluctantly, the others followed. The stairs creaked under their feet, and the air grew colder with each step. When they reached the bottom, they found themselves in a long, narrow hallway. The walls were damp, and the floor was covered in puddles. Strange symbols were scratched into the walls, and the smell of mildew was overwhelming. "I don't like this," Emma said, shivering. "Neither do I," Jake admitted. As they walked down the hallway, they noticed doors on either side. Most were locked, but one was slightly ajar. Max pushed it open, and they stepped inside. The room was small and filled with old filing cabinets. On a table in the center, there was a stack of papers and a dusty notebook. Lisa picked up the notebook and opened it. "It's a journal," she said, flipping through the pages. "It belonged to one of the doctors here." "What does it say?" Sarah asked. Lisa began to read aloud. The entries were written in messy handwriting and talked about experiments on the patients. The doctor described strange noises, patients disappearing, and shadowy figures roaming the halls. "This is getting worse and worse," Jake said. "Maybe we should leave." Before anyone could answer, the door slammed shut behind them. Emma screamed, and they all turned to see that the door wouldn't budge. "It's stuck," Max said, pulling at the handle. "How?" Lisa asked. "No one else is here. Or maybe there is," Sarah said quietly, her eyes wide. Suddenly, the lights in the room flickered, even though the building had no power. A low, chilling laugh echoed around them. They huddled together, their flashlights shaking in their hands. "Who's there?" Max shouted, his voice cracking. There was no answer, but the laugh grew louder. Shadows began to move across the walls, and a cold breeze swept through the room. The friends screamed as a ghostly figure appeared in front of them. It was a tall, pale woman in a tattered hospital gown, her eyes dark and hollow. She pointed at the journal in Lisa's hands and whispered, "Leave, now." The door suddenly flew open, and the friends didn't wait to be told twice. They ran out of the room, down the hallway, and up the stairs as fast as they could. The sounds of laughter and footsteps followed them, growing louder and louder. When they finally burst out of the front door, they didn't stop running until they were far from the asylum. Out of breath and shaking, they collapsed onto the ground, their hearts racing. "What just happened?" Emma asked, tears streaming down her face. I don't know, Max said, his voice trembling. But we're never going back there. The friends sat in silence, trying to process what they had seen. The asylum's dark silhouette loomed in the distance, a chilling reminder of the night they would never forget. From then on, they promised to stay far away from the haunted asylum and its terrifying secrets. The mirror in the attic, the creaky old Victorian house, stood at the edge of a quiet town, surrounded by tall trees and overgrown bushes. It was a place filled with memories, both happy and sad. For years, it had been home to the Baker family, but now only Grandma Baker lived there. She was a kind woman, always baking cookies and telling stories about the past. When her granddaughter, Lily, came to visit for the summer, she didn't expect anything unusual to happen. But the house had secrets that were waiting to be uncovered. Lily was a curious 16-year-old with long brown hair and a love for exploring. She loved the old house charm, its tall ceilings, winding staircase, and the attic she was never allowed to enter as a child. One afternoon, while Grandma Baker was busy knitting downstairs, Lily decided to finally see what was hidden up there. The attic door creaked loudly as she pushed it open, revealing a dusty room filled with forgotten treasures. The air was musty, and sunlight streamed in through a small, dirty window. Boxes were stacked high, filled with old books, toys, and photographs. A large wardrobe stood in one corner, and an antique mirror leaned against the wall. The mirror immediately caught Lily's eye. It had an ornate golden frame carved with intricate patterns of vines and flowers. The glass was slightly foggy, but still reflected the room clearly. Something about it felt strange, almost as if it was watching her. Lily wiped the dust off the mirror and smiled at her reflection. Just an old mirror, she said to herself. But as she turned to leave, she thought she saw something move in the glass. She froze and looked back, but there was nothing there. Shaking her head, she laughed nervously. I'm just imagining things. That night, as Lily lay in bed, she couldn't stop thinking about the mirror. It was beautiful, but it also gave her a strange feeling. She decided to bring it down to her room the next day. After breakfast, she climbed back into the attic and carefully carried the mirror downstairs. She placed it against the wall in her bedroom, admiring how it made the room look bigger. For the next few days, everything seemed normal. Lily spent her time helping Grandma Baker in the garden, reading books, and going for walks around the neighborhood. But at night, she started having strange dreams. In them, she was standing in front of the mirror, but her reflection wasn't her own. Instead, shadowy figures moved behind the glass, their faces hidden. The dreams were so vivid that she woke up sweating and scared. One evening, as Lily brushed her hair in front of the mirror, she saw a flicker of movement behind her. Her heart raced as she turned around, but her room was empty. When she looked back at the mirror, everything seemed normal again. It's just my imagination, she whispered, trying to convince herself. But the strange occurrences didn't stop. The next day, Lily was folding clothes when she heard a soft whisper. She looked around, but no one was there. The sound seemed to come from the mirror. She leaned closer, her breath fogging up the glass. Suddenly, a cold breeze brushed past her, even though the windows were closed. She jumped back, her heart pounding. Lily decided to tell her grandmother about the mirror. "Grandma, do you know anything about the mirror in my room?" she asked during dinner. Grandma Baker's face turned pale. She set down her fork and stared at Lily. "You brought that mirror down from the attic?" she asked, her voice trembling. Lily nodded, confused. "Is something wrong with it?" Her grandmother sighed deeply. "That mirror belonged to your great-grandmother. It's been in the family for generations. But there's a dark story attached to it. People say it's cursed." Lily's eyes widened. "Cursed? What do you mean?" Grandma Baker hesitated before continuing. "Many years ago, strange things started happening in our family after that mirror came into the house. People claimed to see shadows moving in the glass, and there were unexplained deaths. Your great-grandmother tried to get rid of it, but it always seemed to find its way back. Eventually, we decided to lock it away in the attic." Lily felt a chill run down her spine. "Do you think it's dangerous?" "I don't know," Grandma Baker admitted. "But if it's making you uncomfortable, we should take it back to the attic." That night, Lily tried to sleep, but the mirror's presence in her room felt overwhelming. She couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. Around midnight, she heard a faint tapping sound. Sitting up in bed, she saw that the noise was coming from the mirror. Her hands trembled as she got out of bed and approached it. The tapping grew louder, and then she saw it, a shadowy figure in the glass, reaching out as if trying to escape. Lily screamed and ran to her grandmother's room. "Grandma, there's something in the mirror," she cried. Her grandmother hurried to her room and gasped when she saw the mirror. The shadowy figure was still there, its movements slow and eerie. "We need to cover it," Grandma Baker said, grabbing a sheet and throwing it over the mirror. The room fell silent, but the sense of unease lingered. The next day, they moved the mirror back to the attic. But Lily couldn't stop thinking about it. She wanted to understand what was happening. Why was the mirror showing shadows? And what was its connection to the mysterious deaths in her family? Lily decided to investigate. She spent hours in the library, reading old family journals and newspaper articles. She learned that her great-grandmother had bought the mirror from an estate sale. The previous owner had died under mysterious circumstances, and rumors of the mirror's curse had followed it ever since. As Lily dug deeper, she discovered a pattern. Every family that owned the mirror experienced tragedy. Determined to break the curse, Lily returned to the attic one evening with a flashlight and a notebook. She stared at the covered mirror, her heart pounding. Slowly, she pulled off the sheet. The glass seemed darker than before, and the shadowy figure appeared almost immediately. "Who are you?" Lily whispered. To her shock, words began to appear on the glass, written in frost. "Help me!" Lily gasped. "How can I help you?" she asked. The figure pointed to the notebook in her hand. Lily realized it wanted her to write something down. "What do you want me to do?" she asked, her voice shaking. Over the next hour, the mirror revealed its story. The shadowy figure was the spirit of a woman who had been trapped in the mirror for decades. She had been cursed by a jealous rival who practiced dark magic. The curse bound her soul to the mirror, and she could only be freed if someone performed a ritual to break the spell. The instructions for the ritual were complex, involving candles, a special chant, and an object that belonged to the cursed woman. Lily found herself torn. She wanted to help the trapped spirit, but she was also terrified. What if something went wrong? After discussing it with her grandmother, they decided to perform the ritual. Grandma Baker found an old locket in the attic that had belonged to the woman. Together, they gathered the items needed and waited until midnight when the moon was high. The ritual was intense. As Lily recited the chant, the mirror began to shake, and the room filled with a cold winds. The shadowy figure in the glass grew brighter, transforming into the image of a beautiful woman. With a final, powerful burst of light, the mirror shattered, and the woman's spirit was released. Lily and her grandmother watched in awe as she smiled and disappeared into the night. From that day on, the house felt lighter, as if a great weight had been lifted. Lily knew she had done the right thing, even though it had been scary. The summer ended, and she returned home, but she never forgot the mirror in the attic and the secret it held. It was a reminder that even the darkest mysteries could be solved with courage and determination. The witch's forest in a small, quiet village nestled at the edge of a dark and mysterious forest. People lived simple lives. They planted crops, tended to animals, and told stories around the fire. One story, however, was whispered with fear, the legend of the witch's forest. The villagers believed that this forest was cursed, and anyone who entered it on Halloween would never return the same. They said a ghostly witch lived among the trees, waiting to cast her curse on anyone foolish enough to step into her domain. The forest was thick, with trees so tall they blocked most of the sunlight. Their twisted branches seemed to grab at the sky, and the ground was covered in a blanket of fallen leaves and thick moss. Strange sounds came from within rustling leaves, the hoot of owls, and sometimes an eerie whisper that sent shivers down the spines of anyone nearby. Even during the day, the villagers avoided going too close. One chilly October evening, the village buzzed with excitement. Halloween was just around the corner, and children dressed in makeshift costumes ran through the streets, laughing and shouting. Jack-o'-lanterns glowed on doorsteps, and the smell of freshly baked pumpkin pie filled the air. But not everyone was carefree. In one small house at the edge of the village, a boy named Ethan was worried. His pet dog, Max, had gone missing. Max was Ethan's best friend. The two were inseparable, always playing together in the fields or running through the meadows. Max was a small, scruffy dog with floppy ears and a wagging tail that never seemed to stop. But earlier that day, Max had chased after a squirrel and disappeared into the forest. Ethan stood at the edge of the witch's forest, calling Max's name. His voice echoed back, but there was no sign of his furry friend. The villagers had warned him never to go into the forest, especially not on Halloween. But as the sun began to set, Ethan made a decision. He couldn't leave Max out there alone. Taking a deep breath, Ethan stepped into the forest. The air immediately felt colder, and the shadows seemed to stretch and move around him. "Max!" he called again, his voice trembling. The only answer was the sound of leaves crunching under his feet. Ethan wandered deeper, holding a small lantern to light his way. The trees grew denser, their branches forming eerie shapes. His heart pounded as he thought about the stories of the witch. Was she real? Would he be cursed forever if she found him? As he walked, Ethan began to notice strange things. A patch of mushrooms glowed faintly in the dark. A spider's web sparkled as if it were made of silver. And then there were the whispers. They were soft at first, like the wind rustling the leaves, but soon they grew louder. It sounded like voices calling his name. "Ethan!" He spun around, holding up his lantern, but there was no one there. Fear crept into his mind, but he kept going. He had to find Max. Finally, Ethan heard a bark. His heart leapt with relief. "Max!" he shouted, running toward the sound. But as he got closer, the barking stopped. Instead, he saw a shadowy figure standing between the trees. It was a woman, but not like anyone Ethan had ever seen. Her skin was pale and seemed to glow in the dark. Her hair flowed around her like smoke, and her eyes were as black as the night. She wore a tattered cloak that swayed, even though there was no wind. "You should not be here," the woman said in a voice that was both soft and cold. Ethan's hands shook as he clutched his lantern tighter. "I'm just looking for my dog," he stammered. "Have you seen him?" The woman tilted her head, her dark eyes studying him. "The forest is no place for children," she said. "Especially not tonight." Ethan's heart raced. "Please, I just want to find Max and go home." The woman's lips curled into a faint smile. "Your dog is here," she said. "But if you wish to leave with him, you must do something for me." Ethan hesitated. The stories were true. She was the witch. But he couldn't leave without Max. "What do you want me to do?" he asked. The witch raised her hand, and a small, glowing orb appeared above her palm. It pulsed with an eerie green light. "This is a piece of my power," she said. "Take it to the heart of the forest and place it in the hollow of the oldest tree. Only then will I release your dog." Ethan didn't understand why she wanted him to do this, but he nodded. "Okay, I'll do it." The witch handed him the orb, and the moment it touched his hand, he felt a strange warmth spread through his fingers. "Be warned," she said. "The forest will test you. If you fail, you will never leave." With that, the witch vanished, and Ethan was alone again. He looked down at the orb, its green glow lighting up the darkness around him. Taking a deep breath, he started walking deeper into the forest. The path ahead was not easy. The trees seemed to close in around him, and the whispers grew louder. He saw strange, shadowy figures darting between the trees, always just out of reach. At one point, the ground beneath him shifted, and he nearly fell into a hidden pit. But he kept going, determined to save Max. Finally, Ethan reached the heart of the forest. In the center stood an enormous tree, its trunk so wide it would take several people to wrap their arms around it. The tree's branches stretched high into the sky, and its bark was covered in strange, glowing symbols. Ethan approached the hollow in the tree, holding the orb tightly. As he reached out to place it inside, the forest seemed to come alive. The whispers turned into a deafening roar, and the shadowy figures closed in. Ethan's hands shook, but he forced himself to complete the task. The moment the orb touched the hollow, a blinding light filled the forest. Ethan shielded his eyes, and when he opened them, everything was quiet. The shadowy figures were gone, and the forest no longer felt menacing. Ethan turned around and saw Max running toward him, his tail wagging furiously. "Max!" he cried, scooping up his dog in his arms. He was so relieved he didn't notice the witch standing nearby until she spoke. "You have done well," she said. Her voice was softer now, almost kind. "The curse of the forest has been lifted, for tonight at least. You may go." Ethan didn't wait to be told twice. Holding Max tightly, he hurried back through the forest. The path seemed shorter this time, and soon he was back at the edge, the lights of the village glowing in the distance. He turned to look back, but the forest was dark and silent once more. Ethan never spoke of what happened that night, but he and Max never ventured near the forest again. The villagers noticed that the eerie whispers and strange sounds stopped after that Halloween, but the legend of the witch's forest lived on, passed down through the years. And though the forest seemed less threatening, no one dared to test its boundaries just in case the witch was still watching. From that day forward, Ethan learned to treasure the quiet safety of the village and the bond he shared with Max. The forest had tested him, but he had faced his fears and come out stronger. And though he never saw the witch again, he often wondered if, deep down, she had been rooting for him all along. The Ghosts of Hollow Creek Road. Hollow Creek Road was a place people in town didn't like to talk about. It was long, winding, and empty, cutting through dense woods that seemed to grow darker as the sun set. For years, the road had a reputation for being dangerous. Cars often skidded off the sharp turns, and there were countless stories of fatal accidents. Locals called it cursed, but most outsiders laughed at the idea. On Halloween night, a truck driver named Tom was on his usual route. He wasn't one to believe in ghost stories or superstitions. To him, Hollow Creek Road was just another road, a shortcut to his delivery destination. Tom had a long night ahead and a schedule to keep, so he didn't think twice about taking the infamous road. The evening had started off like any other. Tom hummed along to the radio as his truck rumbled down the empty highway. The crisp autumn air carried the faint smell of fallen leaves, and the moon hung low in the sky, casting a pale glow over the trees. As Tom turned onto Hollow Creek Road, the atmosphere seemed to shift. The tall trees on either side of the road loomed closer, their branches twisting together like bony fingers. The radio signal started to fade, leaving only static. Tom tried to shake off the uneasy feeling creeping over him. A few miles down the road, Tom saw a figure standing on the shoulder. It was a man wearing a tattered jacket, his thumb out for a ride. Hitchhikers were rare these days, especially in the middle of nowhere, but Tom was a kind-hearted guy. He slowed the truck and rolled down the window. "Need a lift?" Tom asked. The man nodded silently and climbed into the passenger seat. He looked tired, his face pale and gaunt. "Where you headed?" Tom asked, trying to make conversation. "Just up the road," the man replied in a low voice. His tone was calm but distant, as if his mind was somewhere else. Tom shrugged and focused on driving. The man didn't say much, and Tom wasn't one to push for small talk. The silence in the truck felt heavy, broken only by the sound of the engine and the occasional rustle of leaves outside. After a few minutes, Tom glanced over at his passenger, but the seat was empty. His heart skipped a beat. He slammed on the brakes and pulled over, staring at the empty seat in disbelief. There was no way the man could have just disappeared. The door hadn't opened, and he hadn't heard a thing. "What the hell?" Tom muttered, rubbing his eyes as if he might have imagined the whole thing. Shaking his head, he decided to keep driving. Maybe he was just tired, he thought. Maybe his mind was playing tricks on him. But as he continued down the road, things got stranger. The temperature in the truck dropped suddenly, and Tom could see his breath in the air. A chill ran down his spine. The headlights of his truck seemed dimmer, barely piercing through the thick darkness ahead. Then, in his rearview mirror, he saw something that made his blood run cold. There were figures in the road behind him, dozens of them, pale, shadowy shapes that seemed to glide more than walk. Their faces were hollow and expressionless, but their eyes glowed faintly in the darkness. Tom's hands gripped the steering wheel tightly. He hit the gas, trying to put as much distance as he could between himself and the eerie figures. But no matter how fast he went, they stayed close, their shapes flickering in and out of sight. Panic set in as Tom realized he was being followed. He couldn't explain what was happening, but he knew he had to get off Hollow Creek Road. He pressed harder on the gas, his truck roaring as it sped down the winding road. But the faster he went, the more the shadows seemed to close in. Then the whispers started, soft at first, like the rustling of leaves, but growing louder. Tom couldn't make out the words, but the voices sounded desperate, almost pleading. They echoed in his head, making it hard to focus on the road. "Leave me alone," Tom shouted, though he doubted anyone could hear him. The whispers didn't stop. Instead, they grew louder, turning into a chorus of mournful cries. The figures in the rearview mirror seemed to multiply, their glowing eyes fixed on Tom. Just when he thought he couldn't take it anymore, the truck's engine sputtered and died. The headlights flickered out, plunging Tom into complete darkness. "No, no, no," Tom muttered, frantically turning the key in the ignition. The engine wouldn't start. He was stranded, alone on the cursed road, with the ghostly figures closing in. The whispers turned into voices, clear and distinct now. "You have to listen," one voice said. "We were just like you," another added. Tom's heart pounded as he looked around, but the figures were no longer in the mirror. They were outside the truck, surrounding it, their pale faces pressed against the windows, their glowing eyes staring into his soul. "What do you want?" Tom shouted, his voice shaking. One of the figures stepped forward, a woman with a sorrowful expression. She placed a hand on the truck's window, and suddenly Tom's mind was flooded with images. He saw flashes of car crashes, twisted metal, and shattered glass. He saw the faces of people who had died on Hollow Creek Road, their lives cut short by the road's deadly curves. "We're trapped here," the woman's voice echoed in his mind. "You have to help us." "Help you? How?" Tom asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The figures didn't answer. Instead, they stepped back, their forms fading into the darkness. The truck's engine roared to life on its own, and the headlights flickered back on. Tom didn't wait to question it. He gripped the steering wheel and drove, not daring to look back. When he finally reached the end of Hollow Creek Road, the whispers stopped and the oppressive darkness lifted. Tom pulled over, his hands trembling as he tried to catch his breath. He couldn't explain what had just happened, but he knew one thing for sure. Hollow Creek Road wasn't just dangerous. It was haunted. In the days that followed, Tom couldn't shake the memories of that night. He began researching the road's history, uncovering stories of accidents that matched the faces he had seen. Each victim had been a traveler, just like him, who had met their end on that cursed stretch of asphalt. Tom realized the ghosts weren't trying to hurt him. They were trying to warn him and anyone else who dared to travel down Hollow Creek Road. From that night on, Tom avoided the road at all costs, but he made it his mission to share his story. Maybe, he thought, if enough people knew the truth, the spirits could finally find peace. The Pumpkin Patch Packed setting. A small-town pumpkin farm. Just outside a small, peaceful town sat Maple Hollow Pumpkin Farm. It was a quiet, picturesque place, with rows of bright orange pumpkins, colorful leaves scattered on the ground, and a gentle breeze carrying the scent of autumn. Families would visit every year to pick pumpkins, drink cider, and enjoy the warm charm of fall. But Maple Hollow had a secret, a dark, chilling secret that no one dared to talk about. Every Halloween, the farm hosted a famous pumpkin growing contest. Farmers from all over would bring their biggest, heaviest pumpkins, hoping to win the grand prize, a hefty cash reward, and a golden trophy shaped like a pumpkin. The contest had been a tradition for decades, drawing big crowds and plenty of excitement. But some whispered that the farm wasn't as wholesome as it seemed. People said strange things happened there at night, shadows moving where no one stood, eerie whispers in the wind, and lights flickering in the old barn. And every so often, a contestant in the pumpkin contest would vanish without a trace. The rumors were dismissed as silly ghost stories, but one young girl would soon learn the terrifying truth. Meet Lucy and her curious mind. Lucy was 12 years old, with curly brown hair, bright green eyes, and an endless curiosity about the world. She loved solving mysteries and had read every detective book in the library. When her parents took her to Maple Hollow Pumpkin Farm for the Halloween festival, Lucy's excitement was off the charts. She couldn't wait to see the giant pumpkins and maybe even meet the mysterious owner of the farm, Mr. Grayson. Mr. Grayson was an elderly man with a wrinkled face, piercing blue eyes, and a voice that could make the hairs on your arms stand up. He was polite but distant, and he rarely left his farmhouse at the edge of the property. No one knew much about him, except that he had been running the pumpkin farm for as long as anyone could remember. Some kids in town even said he was 100 years old. Lucy and her parents wandered through the farm, admiring the scarecrows, playing games, and sipping hot chocolate. The highlight of the day was the pumpkin contest. Lucy's eyes widened as she saw the massive pumpkins lined up for judging, each one larger than a bathtub. How do they grow them so big? Lucy wondered aloud. Lots of hard work and good fertilizer, I guess, her dad said with a laugh. But Lucy wasn't convinced. Something about the pumpkins seemed strange. Their bright orange skin almost glowed, and they seemed alive, as if they were watching her. She shivered and quickly turned away. The first clue that night, Lucy couldn't stop thinking about the pumpkins. She decided to do some investigating. Armed with a flashlight and her trusty notebook, she snuck out of the house and biked to Maple Hollow Pumpkin Farm. The farm was eerily quiet, with only the rustling leaves and the distant hoot of an owl breaking the silence. Lucy climbed over the wooden fence and made her way to the pumpkin field. Her flashlight beam danced across the massive gourds, casting long, creepy shadows. She knelt beside one of the pumpkins and noticed something odd. The soil around it was dark and wet, almost like blood. Lucy's heart raced as she touched the soil. It was sticky. Before she could investigate further, a faint noise caught her attention. It sounded like a low, guttural growl. Lucy froze. Slowly, she turned her flashlight toward the sound. In the distance, she saw a figure hunched over near the barn. It was Mr. Grayson. He was pouring something onto the soil around the pumpkins from a large, rusty canister. Lucy squinted, trying to see what it was, but the flashlight beam didn't reach that far. Suddenly, Mr. Grayson's head snapped up, and his eyes locked onto hers. Lucy's blood turned to ice. She turned off her flashlight and ducked behind a pumpkin, holding her breath. A chilling discovery the next day. Lucy tried to act normal, but she couldn't stop thinking about what she had seen. What was Mr. Grayson doing? And why did the soil around the pumpkins seem so wrong? She decided to visit the town library to learn more about the farm. After hours of searching old newspapers and records, she stumbled upon an article from 50 years ago. It described how Maple Hollow Pumpkin Farm had been built on the site of an old graveyard. According to the article, the graves had been moved, but some believed the farm was still haunted by restless spirits. Lucy's heart pounded as she read further. Another article mentioned that Mr. Grayson's family had practiced unusual farming techniques. Some locals even claimed that they had seen the Graysons digging in the cemetery late at night. The more Lucy read, the more she realized that the farm's dark history wasn't just a spooky tale. It was real, and she was determined to uncover the truth. The missing contestants that evening, Lucy returned to the farm, this time with her best friend Jake. Jake was a brave and adventurous boy who loved a good mystery almost as much as Lucy did. Armed with flashlights and a camera, the two sneaked into the pumpkin field. As they walked among the giant pumpkins, Lucy explained what she had learned. "I think Mr. Grayson is feeding the pumpkins something unnatural," she whispered. "Like what?" Jake asked, his voice trembling slightly. "I don't know. But we're going to find out." The two friends approached the barn, where Lucy had seen Mr. Grayson the night before. Inside, they found rows of old tools, sacks of fertilizer, and a strange, foul-smelling liquid in barrels. Jake took pictures while Lucy examined the barrels. The liquid inside was thick and dark red. "Is this blood?" Jake whispered, his face pale. Before Lucy could answer, they heard footsteps approaching. They quickly hid behind a stack of hay bales. Mr. Grayson entered the barn, muttering to himself. He carried a large sack that wriggled as if something was alive inside. Lucy and Jake watched in horror as he opened the sack and pulled out a live chicken. He held it over one of the barrels, and Lucy covered her mouth to stifle a gasp. She didn't want to see what happened next, but she couldn't look away. Mr. Grayson was using the blood from the animals to feed the pumpkins. The pumpkin's secret. Lucy and Jake left the barn as quietly as they could and ran back to town. They knew they had to tell someone, but who would believe them? The idea of a farmer using blood to grow giant pumpkins sounded crazy. Still, Lucy was determined to stop Mr. Grayson. The next day, Lucy and Jake decided to confront Mr. Grayson during the pumpkin contest. The farm was packed with people, and the excitement was palpable. as the judges examined the massive pumpkins. Lucy waited for the right moment and then stood up on a hay bale. "Everyone, listen to me," she shouted. "Mr. Grayson is hiding something terrible." The crowd fell silent, and all eyes turned to Lucy. Mr. Grayson's face darkened, and he stepped forward. "What are you talking about, child?" he asked, his voice cold. Lucy took a deep breath and explained everything she had seen. The crowd murmured in disbelief, but some people began to look uneasy. A few brave souls followed Lucy and Jake to the barn, where they showed them the barrels of blood and the strange tools. The truth comes out Mr. Grayson tried to deny everything, but it was too late. The evidence was overwhelming, and the police were called. As the authorities investigated, they discovered even more horrifying secrets. Mr. Grayson had been using animal blood and possibly even human remains to fertilize the pumpkins for decades. The missing contestants? Their bodies were never found, but the soil around the pumpkins told a gruesome story. Maple Hollow Pumpkin Farm was shut down, and Mr. Grayson was arrested. The townspeople were shocked and horrified by the truth. Lucy and Jake were hailed as heroes for uncovering the dark secret, but the experience left them shaken. A new beginning years later, the farm was turned into a memorial park to honor those who had disappeared. Lucy grew up to become a detective, using her sharp mind to solve mysteries and bring justice to those in need. She never forgot the pumpkin farm or the chilling lesson it taught her. Sometimes the scariest things hide in plain sight.